I still can't fully explain what happened to us that night, and maybe I never will. If you're ever tempted to take a scenic detour off the main highway through the deep American wilderness, be careful. Some roads have a life of their own, and I wish I had never discovered just how malevolent they can be. It's been a while, but these events still haunt me. This is no rumor or fairy tale. It really happened to me and my friends last summer. I can't shake the lingering dread that clings to my every memory of that place. I was traveling with my best friend, Clara, and her boyfriend, Mason. We wanted to see the country by car, exploring small towns and taking side roads whenever they caught our fancy. Mason was all about adventure, Clara about finding unique diners, and I just wanted an escape from routine. We'd only planned our route loosely, deciding to improvise if we came across anything interesting. That's how we found ourselves veering off the interstate late one afternoon, turning onto a narrow, winding road through a dense pine forest. The sun was sliding low, and the trees stood so close they nearly swallowed up the remaining light. We stopped at a lonely gas station right after taking the exit. 2 rusted pumps, a buzzing fluorescent light, and an old man behind the counter who watched us like he'd never expected another soul to appear. While we grabbed snacks, the old man cleared his throat and asked in a grave voice, "Y'all aren't taking that forest road, are you?" I tried to sound casual. "We are, actually. Heading west." He cut me off, his gaze flicking to the window, as though expecting something to be lurking in the trees. "Be careful. That road can twist you around. Some folks get lost, real lost." It was a typical local legend vibe, but something about his tone unsettled me. Clara thanked him, and we headed out. Just before we left, the man spoke again, voice low, barely above a whisper. "Darkness comes quick out there. Don't trust what you see, or hear, or feel. It's not just a road. It's more than that." We drove off, laughing nervously about his warning, but a chill wound through my gut. Soon, the forest swallowed us. The pines stood like silent sentinels. Their needles seemed to block out the waning light. By the time dusk fell, it felt like the sky had vanished altogether. We passed only one other vehicle for a long stretch, a battered old pickup with tinted windows. It drifted by without turning on its headlights, then pulled over to the shoulder and lingered there, ominous. Clara watched it in the side mirror. "Creepy," she muttered. We pressed on, our phones slowly losing service until we had no bars at all. The road stretched on, mile markers out of sync with our progress. Signs pointed to Cheyenne Falls, 14 miles. Then 20 minutes later, Cheyenne Falls, 15 miles. It made no sense, but we convinced ourselves it was just a strange rural quirk. Static hissed on the radio, so we drove in tense silence, the atmosphere thick as wet wool. When Mason spotted a dirt turnoff labeled High Bluff Overlook, he insisted on checking it out. Despite the creeping dread, we needed a break. We followed a narrow trail up through the trees, flashlights in hand. The silence was suffocating. No insects, no rustling leaves, just our own footsteps echoing in the stillness. We emerged onto a rocky ledge, just in time to see the last ember of twilight sink behind the endless sea of pines. The hush was beautiful, yet unnerving. Not wanting to be caught in total darkness, we headed back quickly. That's when we noticed bare footprints pressed into the mud, overlapping some of our own tracks. The realization that someone or something had followed us caused our blood to run cold. We rushed to the car and locked the doors. We debated turning back, but the forest road was winding. and we weren't sure how far the gas station was. We chose to keep going, hoping to reach a small town or a motel soon. An hour later, headlights appeared behind us. It was that same battered pickup, its lights now blazing. It sped up, tailgating us aggressively. My palms grew slick on the steering wheel. I pressed the accelerator, trying not to lose control on the twisting road. The pickup honked, long and angry, then flashed its high beams repeatedly. Mason urged me to keep driving faster, and my heart pounded so fiercely I thought it might burst. Suddenly, the truck's headlights cut out, and when I glanced in the rearview mirror, it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. In a suffocating hush, we continued, nerves frayed to the limit. Eventually, we saw a flickering neon sign for a motel, the first structure in miles. The sign read, Ilva Pine NNN, with missing letters that barely lit. It looked run down, but we were desperate for any kind of respite. We parked under a buzzing security light and entered a dim, musty office. A middle-aged woman stared at us with hollow eyes. She barely spoke, handing over keys to rooms 3 and 4. Cash only, she said. The place felt stuck in time, as if it existed outside normal reality. With no better option, we took the keys and found our rooms. All 4 doors along the corridor glowed under flickering bulbs. In front of room 1, a broken rocking chair gently moved on its own, creaking softly. The curtain in room 2's window shifted, as though someone stood just behind it. Mason and Clara went into room 3. I took room 4. Inside, a single flickering lamp lit a space that reeked of mildew and neglect. Exhaustion took over, and I collapsed on the bed, hoping for a few hours of uneasy sleep. I awoke to a scratching sound at the wall. My phone read 2:14 a.m. No service. The scratching became a tapping, deliberate, insistent. My mouth went dry as I tiptoed to the window and peered through the curtain. The neon sign sputtered weakly over an empty lot. The rocking chair in front of room 1 was still now, dead still. The scratching sound moved toward the door. It became too much. I yanked the door open to catch whoever was out there, but saw nothing except footprints in the gravel, bare footprints that led away into the darkness. My breath caught in my throat. Then I noticed room 2's door was open a crack, an awful stench wafting out. It smelled like rancid earth and decaying leaves. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, as if pulled by an invisible hand. I ran back into my room, locked the door, and stood there, heart thudding. After a minute of terror, I realized I had to check on Clara and Mason. Summoning courage, I went outside again and hurried to room 3, knocking loudly. Mason opened the door, his eyes wide with alarm. Clara sat up in bed, clearly shaken. I told them what happened, and Clara said she'd heard footsteps near their window. We all agreed we couldn't stay. We grabbed our bags and rushed to the car, ignoring the empty office and the still flickering motel sign. The engine turned over, and I floored it out of the parking lot, the gravel skittering under the tires. At the edge of the lot, I glimpsed a shape in the rearview mirror, a hunched figure, barefoot, eyes reflecting red in the glow of our taillights. My throat went tight with fear, and I forced myself to look forward. We re-entered that eerie road and passed a sign. Cheyenne Falls, 14 miles. We'd seen it before, yet we seemed no closer to leaving. But then, an intersection with proper streetlights appeared out of nowhere. Normal traffic signals, a connecting highway, and the sense that we'd finally broken free of the forest's grip. The moment we crossed under those lights, it felt like a suffocating presence lifted from our chests. We pulled into a 24-hour diner, slumped into a booth, and stared at one another in disbelief. None of us touched our coffee. Eventually, we found a generic motel near the main highway, where we spent a sleepless night. The next morning, my phone finally picked up service. That's when I noticed a text message, timestamped 2:15 a.m., from an unknown number. "You can't leave. The road calls." My blood ran cold. It was just a string of random digits, no identifiable area code. Yet somehow, it felt more real than anything else that night. We tried to look up the Silver Pine Inn, or anything similar in that region. Nothing. It was like the place never existed. All we had were the battered plastic key tags with the room numbers on them, souvenirs of a place that shouldn't be real. We continued on our trip without taking any more detours, and we eventually returned home. But life never felt quite the same. Every time I drive past a dark wooded area or see a flickering neon motel sign, my heart clenches with dread, remembering those empty halls and the scratching on the walls. If there's any lesson here, it's to heed the warnings, even if they sound absurd. Some roads, some forests, are older and darker than our everyday reality can comprehend. If you spot a sign for Cheyenne Falls 14 miles more than once, don't keep going. Turn around. Abandon the road while you still can, because once it chooses you, it may never truly let you go.
I was always a skeptic. Ghosts, aliens, monsters, none of it made sense to me. I chalked it all up to overactive imaginations and too much late-night TV. That was until I moved into the house on Waverly Drive. I'm sharing this story not because I expect you to believe me, but because I need to get it out before it consumes me entirely. The house was cheap. Too cheap. A sprawling Victorian with peeling white paint and a sagging porch, it looked like something out of a Gothic novel. It had been on the market for years, the realtor told me, and the owner was desperate to sell. Desperate enough to overlook my less than stellar credit score. I should have known something was off when I signed the papers. But when you're living paycheck to paycheck, you don't ask questions about a good deal. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my time scrubbing the grime off the walls, fixing creaky floorboards, and trying to make the place feel less like a tomb. It wasn't until I started working on the basement that things got strange. The basement was the kind of place you'd expect to find in a true crime documentary. Narrow stairs led down to a low-ceilinged room with stone walls and a dirt floor. The only light came from a single, bare bulb that flickered like something out of a horror movie. It smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. I told myself it was just old pipes. While clearing out the basement, I found an old trunk tucked into the far corner, almost hidden behind a rotting wooden shelf. It was locked, but the hinges were so rusted that I managed to pry it open with a crowbar. Inside were old papers, yellowed and brittle with age. Most of them were illegible, but one caught my eye, a letter written in spidery handwriting that was still surprisingly clear. "To whomsoever finds this," it began, "beware the watcher in the walls." The letter went on to describe a presence that lived in the house. Something ancient and malevolent. According to the writer, it didn't start out aggressive. It would simply watch. You'd catch glimpses of it out of the corner of your eye. Feel its gaze on your back when no one was there. But over time, its attention grew more invasive. I laughed it off. Someone had a vivid imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the unease the letter stirred in me. The idea of being watched, even by something imaginary, made my skin crawl. I shoved the trunk into a corner and decided to forget about it. That night, I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, like a mouse skittering in the walls. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blanket over my head like a child. But the sound grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't just scratching anymore, It was tapping. Rhythmic, almost like a code. I told myself it was the house settling or maybe a raccoon that had found its way inside. But when I got up to check, flashlight in hand, I found nothing. No signs of rodents, no branches brushing against the windows. Just silence and the oppressive weight of the darkness. The next day, I convinced myself it was my imagination. Stress, lack of sleep, whatever. But the scratching and tapping came back the following night. And the night after that. Always at the same time, around 3 a.m. Always coming from the walls. Then I started seeing things. At first, it was just shadows. Shapes that didn't quite match the furniture, shifting in the periphery of my vision. I'd turn my head, and they'd be gone. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I saw something behind me in the mirror. Just a blur of movement, low to the ground. My heart leapt into my throat, but when I spun around, the bathroom was empty. The turning point came about a month after I moved in. I'd just gotten into bed when I felt it. A weight at the foot of the mattress, like someone sitting down. I froze. My mind raced through every possible explanation, but none of them made sense. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. And then, slowly, the weight shifted. Whatever it was, it crawled up the bed, the pressure of its hands and knees unmistakable. I felt it stop inches from my face. I bolted upright, flipping on the bedside lamp. The room was empty. My chest heaved, and my skin was slick with sweat. I didn't sleep that night. After that, the activity escalated. Doors slammed shut on their own. Lights flickered and died. Objects disappeared, only to reappear in odd places. I'd wake up to find muddy footprints leading from the basement to my bedroom, but they'd vanish as soon as I tried to follow them. One night, I heard whispering. Faint, barely audible, but unmistakably human. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was insistent, pleading. I covered my ears and screamed for it to stop. When it did, the silence was even worse. Desperate, I called a friend who claimed to be sensitive to the other side. She came over armed with sage and crystals, muttering about cleansing the energy. As she walked through the house, her face grew paler and paler. Finally, she stopped in the basement doorway and refused to go any further. "Something's here," she said. "Something dark. You need to leave." Leave? I couldn't afford to leave. I had sunk every penny I had into this place. Besides, where would I go? But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard the whispering again. Only this time, it wasn't pleading. It was laughing. The next day, I decided to do some research. I spent hours at the local library, digging through old newspapers and records. What I found made my stomach churn. The house on Waverly Drive had a long history of tragedy. Families torn apart, mysterious disappearances, suicides. One article mentioned a woman who had claimed something in the walls had driven her mad. She was found dead in the basement, her fingernails torn and bloody from scratching at the stone. That night, I decided I'd had enough. I packed a bag and made plans to stay at a motel until I could figure out what to do. But the house had other plans. As I headed for the door, it slammed shut in front of me. The lights flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. The air grew heavy, suffocating. And then I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. I ran. I don't even remember how I got out. One moment I was in the house, the next I was standing in the middle of the street, gasping for air. I didn't go back. I couldn't. A week later, the house burned to the ground. The fire marshal couldn't determine the cause, but I think I know. It didn't want me to leave, and when I did, it decided to destroy itself rather than let anyone else in. I've tried to move on, but sometimes, late at night, I hear it. Scratching, tapping, whispering. And I know it's still watching. So if you ever find yourself tempted by a deal too good to be true, think twice. Some things aren't worth the price.